Marcus was only 23 when he went to prison, sacrificing his freedom to protect the woman he loved, Elena. For 7 long years, he held on to hope, dreaming of the life they would one day share. But when he finally walked free, he discovered a devastating truth. Elena had given birth to twins while he was locked away, and their father wasn't a stranger. It was Marcus's own father, Richard. What began as a story of loyalty and love twisted into one of betrayal, obsession, and a brutal act that would leave an entire town shocked forever. Marcus never imagined that one night would destroy the life he had carefully planned. At 23, he was deeply in love with Elena, a woman who filled his world with warmth and promises of forever. They dreamed of building a family, of escaping the small town that felt like a trap. But fate came crashing down when a robbery spiraled out of control. Marcus hadn't even planned to be there, yet Elena's name was suddenly tied to the crime. Fear spread quickly, and with police closing in, he realized someone had to take the blame. If Elena went to prison, her life would be over. He couldn't let that happen. Out of blind devotion, Marcus stepped forward and confessed. He told himself that love demanded sacrifice, that 7 years behind bars was nothing compared to losing her. The courtroom felt like a blur as the judge delivered the sentence. His heart ached when he saw Elena in the gallery, her face pale and unreadable. Was it guilt, fear, or relief? Marcus chose to believe it was love. As the prison doors closed behind him, he clung to the thought that every day he served was a gift of freedom for her. He believed she would wait, that loyalty would be returned with loyalty, and that when those 7 years ended, he would walk in her arms again. But what he didn't know then was that his greatest act of sacrifice was also the first step toward the most brutal betrayal of his life. The prison walls were cold and merciless, but Marcus carried hope like a shield. Each day blended into the next. Rows of cells, the clang of metal doors, and the endless shuffle of footsteps echoing down gray corridors. He was young, angry at first, but the thought of Elena softened the weight of his sentence. He told himself that 7 years was survivable. He had given her freedom, and when he finally returned, their love would be stronger than ever. The early months were the hardest. Nights stretched long, filled with the sounds of men shouting, fighting, or weeping in the darkness. Marcus kept to himself, earning a reputation as quiet but tough. He worked out, read old books from the prison library, and wrote letters to Elena. In those letters, he poured out his heart, telling her about his dreams, his struggles, and his undying love. But her replies never came. At first, he thought the mail had been lost. Later, he convinced himself she was protecting him by keeping distance, waiting until he was free to speak again. Over time, Marcus adjusted to the routine. He learned how to avoid trouble, how to spot danger before it struck, and how to carry himself so no one mistook him for weak. 7 years became his mantra. Every sunrise meant one day closer to her. Whenever despair crept in, he imagined Elena's face, her smile, the warmth of her touch. That vision pulled him through hunger strikes, lockdowns, and the endless loneliness that prison carved into his bones. He endured because of her. He believed that outside those walls, she was waiting, loyal and patient. What Marcus didn't realize was that while his world had stopped, hers had already moved on in ways he could never have imagined. The day of freedom finally came, and Marcus felt the weight of 7 years lift as the prison gates creaked open. The air outside smelled different, richer somehow, and for a brief moment, he let himself believe that everything had been worth it. He stepped out with nothing but a small bag of belongings and a heart pounding with anticipation. In his mind, Elena would be there, waiting with tears in her eyes, ready to reclaim the years they had lost. Every step he took toward the exit filled him with nervous excitement. But when he reached the road, the space was empty. No familiar face, no warm embrace. Only silence and a wide stretch of asphalt. Confusion set in quickly. He scanned the faces of strangers, convinced she would appear at any moment. Minutes turned into hours, and still, she did not come. Marcus tried to steady his thoughts, telling himself she must have been delayed. Maybe she was at work, maybe she hadn't gotten a release date. He refused to believe she had simply chosen not to be there. Determined, he started walking, the hope inside him flickering but not yet dead. He made his way to her old neighborhood, expecting answers, expecting at least a familiar place to reconnect. What he found was Elena living in a world that no longer needed him. From a distance, he saw her stepping out of a house, her movements calm and secure, like a woman who had built a life in his absence. Then he noticed two children, twins no older than 6, playing in the yard. Their laughter pierced his chest like a knife. Marcus froze, the sight stealing his breath. He had survived 7 years for her, but the reunion he had dreamed of seemed to have vanished into thin air. Marcus lingered in the shadows of Elena's new life, watching from a distance as if the world had forgotten him. The house she lived in was far nicer than the tiny apartment they once shared, its yard neatly trimmed, the windows glowing warmly at night. To anyone else, it looked like happiness, but to Marcus, it felt like betrayal wrapped in silence. He told himself he shouldn't judge her so quickly. 7 years was a long time. Maybe she had moved on because she thought he would never come back. Maybe the children weren't even hers. He clung to fragile excuses, desperate to protect the image of Elena he had carried for so long. But the truth grew harder to ignore. Every morning, he saw her walking the twins to school, holding their small hands with the tenderness he once believed was only his. Every evening, she returned to the same house, where laughter spilled out as the children played in the yard. The reality that she had built a family without him burned his chest. Still, Marcus wasn't ready to hate her. He told himself he could forgive. If she explained, if she admitted weakness, maybe they could start again. He imagined stepping into that house, wrapping his arms around her, even being a father figure to the twins. The thought soothed him, but only for a moment. Beneath the surface, anger brewed. He had sacrificed everything, his youth, his freedom, his future, for her. And while he was locked away, she had found comfort elsewhere. His heart told him to hope, but his instincts whispered that something far darker lay beneath the surface of her new life. The whispers reached Marcus slowly, like poison seeping into his veins. At first, it was small talk overheard in the neighborhood, casual mentions that didn't seem real. People spoke of Elena's partner, the man who stayed in the house with her, the man who fathered the twins. Curiosity and dread pulled Marcus closer, forcing him to dig for the truth he wasn't ready to hear. Then came the crushing revelation. The children weren't just anyone's. They belonged to Richard, his own father. Marcus felt his world collapse in an instant. The betrayal was too twisted, too cruel to accept. His father had been the man he once admired, the man who taught him to be strong, the man whose approval he sought as a boy. And Elena, the woman he had protected with his freedom, had chosen Richard in his absence. Together, they had made a family while Marcus rotted in a cell. The twins were living, breathing reminders of his stolen years, of the loyalty that had been mocked behind his back. Every memory replayed in his mind with new venom. The letters he had written, the nights he had cried into the silence, the sacrifices he had made, all wasted. Instead of waiting, Elena had replaced him with the one person who should have protected him most. Rage and heartbreak collided until he could no longer tell them apart. Marcus stood in the dark one night, staring at the house, watching his father play with the children in the yard. The laughter carried through the air, mocking him. In that moment, Marcus knew the truth of his prison years. He hadn't saved love. He had been traded for it. Marcus tried to convince himself he could survive the betrayal, but the wound only deepened with time. Nights became unbearable. He lay awake in the small room he had rented, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the thought of Elena and Richard together. 7 years of sacrifice played like a cruel movie in his head. He imagined her laughing with his father, imagined the touch he once thought belonged only to him, now stolen by the man who had raised him. The bitterness grew heavier each day until it clung to his skin like a second shadow. He stopped eating regularly, his appetite swallowed by anger. Food tasted like ash, and sleep slipped away, leaving his mind restless and raw. He replayed the courtroom in his memory, the day he had confessed. Back then, he believed he was noble, believed he was saving her. Now he saw himself as a fool who had given up everything for someone who never deserved it. His thoughts began to twist. What once had been love turned into an obsession with betrayal. He couldn't pass a single day without picturing the twins, living proof of his father's disloyalty and Elena's weakness. The sound of their laughter echoed in his head long after he had walked away from the house. He felt erased, as if his life had been rewritten to exclude him entirely. The anger started to harden into something darker. Marcus found himself wandering the neighborhood at night, standing outside the fence, staring at the home that had stolen everything from him. In those moments, he felt his sanity slipping. Forgiveness was no longer possible. Something inside him whispered that the only way to silence the torment was to destroy the world that had replaced him. Marcus became a ghost in his own town, slipping through streets unnoticed, always drawn back to the same house. He studied their routines with a patience sharpened by years in prison. In the mornings, Richard left early for work, briefcase in hand, while Elena prepared breakfast for the twins. At midday, she walked them to school, her hand tightly wrapped around theirs. In the evenings, they gathered in the living room, the glow of the television flickering against the curtains. Marcus knew it all, the hours they were gone, the moments they were vulnerable, the very heartbeat of their lives. At first, he told himself he only wanted to understand. He wanted to see for himself what kind of life they had built. But soon, watching turned into feeding his rage. Every smile Richard shared with Elena felt like a knife twisting deeper into Marcus's chest. Every giggle from the children reminded him of years he could never reclaim. He no longer saw them as innocent, but as symbols of betrayal, two living reminders that his father had stolen not just his love, but his future. Marcus moved silently, lurking behind trees or parked cars, learning the angles of the house, the locks on the doors, the times the lights went out. He noticed details most people would ignore: the weak hinge on the back gate, the spare key Richard hid beneath a garden stone. Each discovery settled into his mind like pieces of a puzzle. The obsession consumed him. He stopped searching for work, stopped contacting the few friends who had welcomed him back. His life became theirs, and his thoughts circled around one idea. He had been erased from his own story, and the only way to reclaim it was to end theirs. The line between watching and acting grew thinner every night. The night Marcus chose to act was heavy with rain, the kind that soaked the streets until they shimmered under flickering streetlights. The storm hid his footsteps as he moved toward the house that had haunted him for months. Each drop against his skin felt like fuel, every gust of wind urging him forward. He had spent weeks preparing, memorizing the smallest details, and now his rage had sharpened into a terrifying clarity. The back gate creaked faintly as he pushed it open, but the storm swallowed the sound. The key beneath the garden stone was exactly where he had left it after a practice run days before. He turned it in the lock, his hand steady in a way that frightened even him. Inside, the house smelled of comfort, warm food, laundry detergent, and the faint sweetness of children's toys scattered on the floor. For a moment, Marcus froze, struck by the cruel irony. This was the life that should have been his. This was the happiness he had once dreamed of, now stolen and remade by the two people who had betrayed him most. His footsteps were silent on the carpet as he moved through the rooms. Lightning flashed, throwing shadows across the walls, and in those brief bursts of light, Marcus saw the outlines of Elena and Richard asleep in their bed. Anger roared inside him, louder than the storm outside. Every lonely night in prison, every unanswered letter, every vision of betrayal surged to the surface at once. The control he had fought to maintain snapped like brittle glass. What followed was chaos, screams torn apart by thunder, the sound of struggle, the violent shattering of years of rage. By the time silence fell again, the house no longer echoed with laughter. It was filled with something far darker, the final mark of a man who had been broken beyond repair. When the storm finally eased, the neighborhood was quiet except for the distant wail of sirens cutting through the night. Inside the house, Marcus stood motionless, his chest rising and falling in uneven bursts. The walls around him bore the story of what he had done. Furniture overturned, glass shattered, and the silence of lives that only hours before had seemed untouchable. He felt no triumph, no relief, only emptiness. The rage that had driven him for so long burned out, leaving a hollow shell of a man standing in a wreckage of his own choices. Red and blue lights splashed across the rain-slicked windows as police cars pulled into the driveway. Marcus didn't run. He didn't hide. He simply waited, hands trembling, blood on his clothes, his eyes fixed on nothing. Officers stormed inside, weapons raised, but he barely moved when they shouted commands. They forced him to the ground, cuffed his wrists, and dragged him outside into the flashing storm of light and sirens. Neighbors gathered in the dark, whispering in shock as Marcus was led away. Some recognized him, the man who had once disappeared into prison for love, only to return as something twisted and unrecognizable. His face was pale, his expression unreadable, but when reporters later asked what he said in those final moments, his words sent chills through everyone who heard them. He told the officers that 7 years ago, he had gone to prison for someone else's crime. He had paid for love, for loyalty, for trust. But tonight, he said, he finally paid for his own. With that, Marcus fell silent, staring into the flashing lights. A broken man swallowed once more by handcuffs and steel doors, this time with no illusions left to protect him.